We want to welcome Dr. Pete Kremers today, who's going to speak about Color on the Creek in Frederick. And I'll turn it over to Jim to say a few more words. And I also want to thank Barclay for helping to organize this and get everything lined up. Jim?
Okay. Some of you know that I play my harp down on Carroll Creek Promenade in Frederick. And I met Dr. Kremers there. He is the guiding spirit, the one that had the first idea for Color on the Creek. Dr. Kremers, do you want to speak about the creek itself or what you've been doing?
Well, I mean, I'm going to lay out basically a story that sort of describes how Color in the Creek came to be and
But
why
what
it
about
came to
what
be.
about the creek itself?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that.
That too. Let's
Okay.
go ahead
But
and give
anyway,
them.
I was so impressed with what's happening on the creek, and it's really a shame. If we could have gotten Dr. Kramer's schedule for last month, you could actually have come down and seen the creek. Day after tomorrow, it's getting disassembled. But anyway, I saw what had been done, and the minute I realized Dr. Kremers was the one behind it all, I nabbed him. I said, "Do you do talks?" And he said, "Why, yes." And things went from there. So I'll turn it over from you to you now.
Great. So, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I
Okay,
can,
good.
we can.
All right. So, I'm going to speak about Color in the Creek. And basically, it's an unusual thing, this Color in the Creek. It's actually a marriage of a water garden and then a follow-on event in the winter, which takes place over the top of the dormant water garden. And these two organizations, which are Color in the Creek, Water Garden, and Sailing Through the Winter Solstice, which I'll get into, are really married to the hip. It's almost probably 70% overlap between the organizations. And the second half of this presentation is what allows the first half to actually occur because a lot of the monies that come for the water garden all come from the Sailing Through the Winter Solstice event. Um, this is my full disclosure slide. I have advanced degrees in medicine, but I don't have any botany or agriculture, anything that's formal training in what you're about to see. So if you have a really great botany question, I'd ask your neighbor or your cat. You're likely to get a better answer. So what I'm speaking about is sort of why Color on the Creek. Well, the first thing is why Color on the Creek came into existence. So this is Carroll Creek, which is in Frederick, Maryland. We're zone, I guess we've been moved to 7A. And this was in my backyard in 2012. Um, the creek bisects the cultural sides of Frederick. It runs directly west, where the watershed is, to east toward the Monocacy River. It is the crown jewel of a very expensive project that involved both local, um, county, as well as state and federal funds to deal with a recurrent problem. And as you can see, in 2012 they had spent, I think by this time, probably $150 million, and they weren't real happy about the look of this, the capstone, the centerpiece of their project, this Carroll Creek Riverway that had been created. And if we look back in time a little bit, this is Frederick in 72, and I could play the same picture from 1976 when Agnes came in 72, and then another tropical storm hit in 1976. Downtown Frederick was flooded, $70 million in damage at that time. And importantly, this recurrent flooding, we were clearly in the 100-year floodplain, prevented economic development along the creek and really three to four blocks out from the creek. because insurance just couldn't be obtained. So the city devised a unique plan to divert the floodwaters, hurricanes, large storms, into 4 massive subterranean conduits, which are depicted here both to the left and right of midline. And then in the middle is this sort of showcase artificial creek, which is basically cement with benite clay and some riprap. This was the plan so that we could bring pedestrians along the promenade, where you hear the harpist playing, and all sorts of other events could be held almost at water level, as opposed to digging a deep ditch and just having it fill up during the rainstorms and then look like an ugly deep ditch the rest of the year, sort of like LA. So if we look to the west towards the watershed, there's a large holding basin, and then when this is the tropical, this is just a thunderstorm, really, a bad one from the summer. And basically all the excess water spills out of the basin over these weirs into these 4 tunnels. So there's 2 arches here and a couple here. And then the rest of it goes down the center of the creek. And that's what you see when you come to Frederick. And it was really effective. So in 2012, when Sandy passed right over the top of Frederick, I happened to be downtown. I was attending a hurricane party and I had my waders. So I thought I'd go down to the creek, and then I hopped in. This is the middle of Sandy, which was a devastating storm, right? A lot of rain. And the point of this slide, in addition to showing that I'm an idiot, is that the water level and the speed, the velocity of the water was no different than on an average, July rainy day. It really was engineered extremely well in terms of dealing with large volumes of water. Those 6 conduits can hold 6 million cubic feet of water. The problem is in the summer. So this yellow bar represents the natural cross section of the creek, the upstream creek to the west of Frederick. And the problem is you dump it into this reservoir that's much deeper, much wider, and extends about 3 miles in length. So it's like putting a garden hose into a swimming pool on one end and a garden hose on the other end to drain it. You can imagine what happened. And to further compromise this, we're subject to a lot of just cultural eutrophication. So we have, the mountains to the west, but then we have all these paddocks with dairy and beef cattle and waterfowl, and a lot of them, the runoff goes right into these little ponds, which are filled with algae and other plant life, and then into the tributaries that feed into Carroll Creek. So what we have is stagnant water because of the design elements. We have sun all day long. It runs east to west, and you cannot shade this because of those large conduits. You can't get large trees anywhere close to this creek. So you have basically sun all day long, and then of course the nutrients, as I mentioned, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and a little E. coli to throw in as well, that go into that creek. So if you want to grow algae, this is what you do. So I was having a drink with my girlfriend at the time, this is Lisa Collins in 2012. And I was up at Deep Creek Lake, and I read this thing in the newspaper. It was one of the aldermen who was just tired of getting everyone wrath about the creek. And, they had tried bioballs and a number of other things, and it just hadn't figured out solutions yet. And she basically wrote a letter to the community that said, just get over it. The creek's always going to look this way. Just move on. And so I kind of, we talked to Lisa, and we sort of took that as a challenge. And I started looking into things, about eutrophication, which is what this is. It's cultural eutrophication. It's a rapid enrichment of a body of water due to, fertilizers from farmland and residential and other sources. And some of the solutions are riparian barriers, where you build trees along the river or along the stream banks, deep and superficial aeration, black water dyes like you see the Chicago River at St. Patty's Day, or at the Masters, where they dye the golf course water black to cut out the sunlight. Bioballs, and then the other thing is to increase the circulation. None of these were actually going to work. There was too much flow for dyes, and basically circulating that water wouldn't do anything other than chop up the invasive plants and make them even more prolific. So I'd always been intrigued by water gardens, and but I didn't really have any experience until 2020 when I put a little water garden in my backyard, and I've been messing around with that ever since. So I had about, I don't know, 12 years of sort of experience or making a lot of mistakes in my own water garden before I went after this project. And my vision, if you will, was this, beautiful water garden. But I really didn't know much about the creek, which I had to learn as we went along. What we did is we came up with this little poster, something beautiful is about to happen, think Monet. We went out to the garden clubs in Frederick, the Rotary clubs, and I just talked to a lot of people about it. We went to the public itself a little bit, started asking questions, what they thought. I thought about raising some money, although we didn't really raise any money initially. And then obviously to come up with a plan. And I really didn't know if people would rather have, that water garden like Monet's garden in their backyard, or have one of these things in their driveway. And I didn't have a good feel for the way our community was going to react to this. So in 2012, established a small test garden, put about 20 plants or so into the creek. And basically, the way this was done was I built a bunch of piers out of cinder blocks, piled them one on top of another, and then just perched a pot on the top to see what it would look like. Try and get some ideas for what the bottom was like, what kind of a system I would need to design to upscale this. All right. And also, just to have the public, that was walking by look and see, the pretty, red flare or, day bloomers. I put a lot of tropicals out there actually that first time around because of the vibrancy of the colors and things. But so anyways, I put this thing in and it was amazing. So the day I put it in there, the creek looked horrible. It was laden with algae and all this kind of stuff, right? And then about a week afterwards, all the algae went away. And basically, a lot of people thought that the water garden, this 10 by 20-foot water garden, had miraculously, gotten rid of the algae. But, we obviously knew better than that, but we didn't tell anybody because we were trying to convince them to engage in this project. So what we found out in very short order was not only were we clueless, I mean, in other words, a water garden in your backyard that's 10 by 20 feet is not the same as this animal. This creek is very late to warm. It rarely gets above 78 degrees. Usually it's 68 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cold if you are thinking about a lot of the typical water plants that you might want there. And we also had a lot of critters. We had literally hundreds and hundreds, maybe 1,000 large carp and koi. We also had muskrats. We didn't have any great white sharks. So we were, thinking this is really going to be a disaster. The more we got into it, the more we really started to study the creek. But we assembled a board of friends, John Sanders, who is currently at the Glenstone, Mitch Rawls' place there in Potomac. He was at Lily Ponds at the time, and I enlisted his help and advice for selection of plants. And then we just got a lot of business people, and I did get a professor of botany at the local college to come to a couple meetings. But most of them were just logistical people. They were builders and tradesmen and welders and people that I could, help us formulate a plan. First thing I did though was design these special stands that hold both 19 and larger 48 quart pots. And the reason for this is all the perennials, of which let's just say there's 4,000 perennials, we might have 600 tropicals. And the tropicals are obviously annual up here. So the tropicals come in and are discarded every year. The perennials just stay there. We don't do anything with them, by the way. We just leave them alone, cut off the vegetation. We don't lower them. These pots probably weigh 220 pounds once they're, soggy and have a big root ball. So at any rate, we originally started with about 350 or so of these stands. We're up to about 700 now. And we put little floats on each stand, and then we stuck them out in the creek. So this is the Carroll Creek in the early spring of 2013, which was our first year. And these bobbers float to the surface and mark where all the stands are. Because once we get in there, start walking around, it gets muddy and you can't see anything. So we came up with a little plan scheme. Initially, we had very detailed, you know, a certain plant was going to go into a certain stand, and we had all these color schemes and groupings, and I was trying to follow the color palettes of Monet and things like that. Over the years, we've evolved into a much more, I guess I'd call it random placement for a lot of reasons. Some of which is just the logistics, but also um, planning on getting a given plant to a given stand location really magnifies our workload about threefold. So now if you come up there, it's going to be different every year. The first year we probably had 250 volunteers that showed up from the Men's Garden Club of Frederick and the Carroll Creek Rotary. We had a lot of community, non-aligned community support that came in as well. This just shows a typical system we had where we basically prepare all the plant material, put some stone on it, and then drop it into one of the stands in the creek. And this, I think, is probably that first planting season as well from 2013. We developed little ramps because, even the dry pots probably weigh 180 to 200 pounds. So we'd use those sliding boards to move things into the creek. This was the very first summer. So this is the summer of 2013. And I thought, well, that wasn't so bad. Everything looked pretty good, and certainly an improvement over what we started with. And these are just a few more slides from that year and a few subsequent years. And as I say, it changes every year because of the sort of the randomness. We prune during the course of the summer, probably once things get rolling, probably every week or so. We're in the creek. Early on, this is one of the guys. This is Jean-Louis Page, and I don't know. He thought he was at Woodstock, and he's in the water with his shirt off, and there's a huge concert going on right on the other bank. But he was kind of a free spirit. We have work sessions, so we plant. Or I'm sorry, we do a clean of the creek in April, where we lower the water level like this. We right all the stands that have been toppled throughout the winter. We fertilize all the perennials and just get things in order. And by the way, we use groups from boys clubs and the Rotary clubs, both men and women's garden clubs. It's really kind of a very interesting mix of people that show up for these events. But typically we use, I don't know, 50 to 70 volunteers for our work sessions, which last about 2 hours typically. This is just another one showing our work sessions. We provide waders, long gloves, and just they figure it out. This is my daughter actually taking a picture of me. I was taking a picture of her, but this is just to show you some of the plants. So we use a variety of plants, lotus. We have this it looks like a blue beauty. These are probably red flare. So we use day blooming perennials, night blooming tropicals, as well as some tropical bog plants like Egyptian palm or cypress. We also use canna as well. And we try and mix things up a little bit. This looks like Panama Pacific. I don't know how many of you are water gardeners, but the thing about water plants is, in general, they are a lot easier to take care of than terrestrial plants. Number one, in a situation like this, you don't have to worry about watering them, overwatering, underwatering. And the number of pests that prey on water plants is much more limited. We have a few things like sandwich man and a few caterpillars that can go after our lotus, but in general, it's an easier lift. When I first saw these kids, I thought for sure they were looking at the beautiful plants. It turns out one of the kids had lost his skateboard into the creek. This is from, I think, last summer. I took this picture. Often when I'm pruning is when I take my pictures because you get this water level view, which is really very spectacular because it superimposes the plants on each other, and it makes you really appreciate the scene more than just even walking on the creek side. So one of the things, as I mentioned, is that we have a cold problem. So the what we've done is originally we planted the tropicals. We started in May, and there were too many years where we just would lose too much material. So we ultimately went to a local cemetery. This is the Francis Scott Key Cemetery, where Francis Scott, this is Mount Olivet, I should say, where Francis Scott Key is buried. And they had an old greenhouse, which was now basically a hothouse that they weren't using. So I asked them if we could use it, and they said yes. So we built these large, long troughs. They're about 80 feet long. We have three of them currently, plus some additional shelf space. And the idea was to bring in our tropicals. This is a planting session from this spring. And actually, this is Tim Jennings from Longwood Gardens and Suzanne Boom, who's now the current president of the International Water Garden Society. And they came down to check us out and actually help plant as well. So this is what happens over the course of about 6 weeks. Our plants root, they bloom, and then we wait until mid to late June or even the first week in July to transfer the pots into the creek. It's obviously more work to do it this way, but it allows the creek to warm up and allows our plants to become more established before we transfer them. So in the spring, we drop all those, or in July, we drop all those tropicals in, and these are just flags and bobbers marking empty stands where the plants are going to go. We feed them with a mixed fertilizer into the soil. So we feed them once just in the spring when we initially plant them, and then we're done. Many water gardeners will have you out pushing tabs into the pots, every 10 days or 2 weeks. And that's just not possible when you have, hundreds and hundreds of these pots. And I don't know if I didn't mention it, but we're entirely self-supporting. We don't have any paid staff. Everything's volunteers. So we're always looking at ways to save on labor and the amount of attention that we have to put into the water garden once it's planted. This is just sort of a typical day when we have like a little festival with this amphitheater here with a band shell, and I'm not sure exactly what was going on, but this is kind of a typical day along the creek in the summer. Just another festival. So I mentioned we have some problems. We have like muskrats. They love to eat the tubers of lotus. And we also have these marauding koi and carp. And like in this one picture, there's probably at least 30 of these fish, and they're 3 feet long, some of them. I originally started putting caps on this because after the first year, the muskrats had come in and just dug up and ate all the tubers from the lotus. So I had to replant all of those. So these were initially designed as caps to keep the muskrats out. I've subsequently changed that into a totally internalized cap so that we leave them on year round. The lotus just grow right up through these. We can fertilize lotus through these, they're probably almost 2 by 2 inch squares, but the fish can't dig down into this. In fact, this year we planted, I guess, 150 new lotus. There was another place that I built a little water pond and basically grew these lotus for planting this year. And lotus are amazing. That's 3 lotus per 50 quart pot, and they were all blooming early in the summer. So it's pretty pretty good environment with the sun that we have. The other problem, in addition to the muskrats, is obviously the koi, and the koi love to root around in a typical pot. And we originally started with pea gravel, and that went to a larger and larger gravel, but came up with this idea just to use pond liner. And the fish can poke at this all they want, but it's like a cast saw. They just bounce off of it. And so ever since I started using these, we don't lose any soil, and we don't have a tenth the number of floaters because we don't get the koi in there, rooting them out. We're also going to try this next year, which is something we came up with, which is just a steel disc with a rod and a little washer. And the idea is that we put this into the pot and then tie the plant right at the junction of the stems and the roots at the crown. And the idea here is we can take larger plants and possibly just plant them in the creek in July when the creek is already warm enough that we feel we won't shock the tropicals, because this will save us a lot of work in the greenhouse. So we're going to try this with about 100 lilies next year. So the other thing is we were, I think like a lot of the people in the water garden trade, everyone's driven by this thing. This is Devil's Tower from Close Encounters, but this thing called the Victoria, which is the crown jewel, if you will, of water lilies. It's the largest, native to the Amazon. There's 3 varieties. There's Victoria amazonica, Victoria boliviana, and then there's a Victoria cruziana. And basically, they're very similar plants. They can have massive leaves. The most recently described, the boliviana, has lily pads that are over 10 feet in diameter. It's an incredible specimen. It's almost impossible to get it at this point. So we're growing either the Cruziana currently or another variety along with. The main problem, though, with growing Victorias is, they're native to the Amazon. They like water temperature to be at least 80 degrees. And our creek rarely gets to 80 degrees. So before we came up with this little device, our success rate was maybe 10%. We would lose most of them in the greenhouse trying to get them going. And often we would lose them once they were introduced into the creek itself. They would shock. And once you shock these tropicals, they're kind of done. So basically, the idea was to heat the soil. So developed this thing a couple of years ago. And basically, it's a double boiler. So there's a soil pot that contains the lily. There is a water jacket, which is about 2 inches or so. And then outside of that is marine foam as an insulator. And what we do is we just put a temperature probe and a heater into that water jacket. We jack up the temperature of the water in that jacket to 95 degrees or so. And within a day or two, the soil's at 95. And it's very cheap. These are just, aquarium water heaters off the shelf. It's about $30 for one of these things. And this is what the whole system looks like. We call it a Victoria pod. It's got 3 of these insulated jackets with the center, and then there's a control area here, which is where our electronics that power this go. So again, there's an outer pot with foam around it, with a heater, and this then gets filled up with water, and this smaller container goes on top. So we're heating the water in and around the soil. And this is what the control area looks like. These are just individual thermostats, and then wires that go out to the heaters in each pot. Actually, the first time I put this in, I had a guy with me. I didn't really know who he was. I'd met him in the bar the night before. And he kept saying, don't cut the red wire. Don't cut the red wire. I had no idea what he was talking about until, I learned he's a bomb disposal expert out at Dulles, and that's his job. In fact, he was in the creek with me yesterday working. But this just shows like this 94 degrees, if you'd read this, that was the temperature of the soil, and 76 degrees was the water temperature. So we had nearly a 20-degree gradient between what the plant normally would see and what it was experiencing in the soil. And as it turns out, these plants really don't care what the water temperature is. It's really what the temperature of the soil is around the crown of the plant. Um, the largest we got last year was about a little over 4 feet in diameter for these pads. This is Cruziana, and sometimes you can get those up to 6 feet. Well, we have such a short season that I doubt we'll get much bigger than this, but I don't know. And this shows the Victoria pod in the water. So there's our tower with all the electronics and then the three individual pots. And these plants, once they get rolling, are prolific in terms of their blooming. I mean, sometimes you'll see, like on this one, I can see 3 or 4 blooms ready to go. I don't know if you know about the Victorias, but it's an interesting flower. The first night it opens up, it's male and it's white and it smells like a pineapple. And this is to attract beetles, which then come in. The flower closes up. There's a little sex party, and then it opens up the following day. The beetles leave to pollinate another plant, and the flower changes from white to pink or even almost red, depends on the variety. It's a really kind of an interesting plant. And it's very prehistoric. I mean, the bottom of this has thorns. There's thorns along all of the stems. And with the Victoria Amazonica, even the sepals are covered in thorns. So it's got this protective mechanism. It has this upturned edge, which some people they still debate what it's for, but I kind of like the idea that it basically rides up over the top of other plants and smothers them, pushes them away. And these plants, actually, the pads move in the water. And some people believe that's a mechanism to clear any plants away from this plant. So this is a friend of mine, Marilyn, and this was last summer, we were fertilizing. So these plants get a lot, they're very heavy feeders. And so we put nutrients, that NutriCoat, which is this balanced fertilizer in the soil, and it lasts about 90 to 120 days. And then we also supplement it with pond tabs. So once it starts to bloom, we're in there about every 10 days. But we're up to like 12 of these Victorias right now. So we can handle that every 10 days, but we wouldn't want to be fertilizing all the other tropicals. This is the picture I took last summer. It looks like the beginning of a second day bloom. So I'm just taking you through a couple pictures. So this is red flare, which is a night bloomer in the foreground. And then this is part of a Vic pod. And it's really, if you've not been to Frederick, it's kind of cool. We've got restaurants now that line the creek on this side. There's a library. There's also a very large, well, it's about a 800 to 1,000 person amphitheater, which is off to the left side of this picture. So there's, and there's brewery. And then once you leave the water garden to the east, there's a brewery district. So a lot of people are going to that and then coming back to the water garden or in the winter to the boats. So basically what makes this work is it's accessible. In fact, it's open 24/7, which is really important because people can utilize this as part of their workout routine, whether it's just walking or riding bikes or jogging in the morning or after work. It's not like a gym, or some of the gyms, I guess, are open 24/7. But the point is, this is a federally supported project. And so traffic cannot be restricted at any time along those promenades. And it's obviously affordable, it's free, and we do our best to make it, attractive, to prune it, and to clean up, debris and things that blow into the creek. So the second part of this talk is what happened after the water garden. We kind of felt good about the water garden, but I don't know, I just thought we could do more. And I'm sure many of you have probably heard of Francis Picabia. He was this sort of avant-garde Frenchman who, phenomenal, painter, writer, philosopher, poet, wrote magazines, just an interesting guy. And I had seen an exhibit in New York, and this was the subtitle: "Our heads are round, so our thoughts can change direction." And that was the way he lived his life. He was constantly evolving, constantly changing, just constantly trying to change things up. And I think that's what the second phase of this was really about. The other side of that is I probably had a drink somewhere and ran into a friend, and we decided to do this. So the event is called Sailing Through the Winter Solstice. Uh, it started in 2016, and this was actually this we started in late November, and then finished our first craft about mid-December. And basically, it was just a 10-foot John boat from Sears with a bunch of Amazon boxes, lights and things. And we built this boat over about 2 weeks. We were up till 2 o'clock in the morning, drinking bourbon and building this boat. And this was the very first year. So this is 2016. And this boat was called, well, Stargazer on the front and USS Hamster on the back. And that was our first foray into what we'll call boat season. But as the years went on, so this is 2016, we're going to enter in our ninth year, we started to have much more elaborate boats. I built this with a friend. This is Starry Night. This is like Van Gogh on acid, if you will. And although we originally, this guy Kyle Thomas and I, who built the first boat, had thought about just sticking to conventional sail plans, yawls and schooners and things like that, we quickly evolved into a much wider variety of craft that we thought would be suitable, for this event. So we started getting octopus and Viking ships and aircraft carriers and all sorts of other different manner of watercraft. And the way that this worked initially, we had 6 or 8 people trying to launch these boats and pull them out. And I think it probably took us 4 hours for one boat the first year. And we quickly tired of that. So then we started bringing in cranes and forklifts. Some of these boats now weigh probably close to 3 tons. And by the way, the boats go in every year the weekend before Thanksgiving, and we take them out usually the second week or so in March. So it's a very long event, which gives us the advantage of not having to worry about being, rained out. I mean, no one wants to spend, $10,000 on something and then have it rained out, and that's part of the problem with a lot of the parade of lights that you see around the country. They have them in Annapolis and Newport, a lot of different places. But if it's a bad weekend, it's a snowstorm or it's raining, it's just hard to watch these ships. We had the advantage of having this beautiful, these promenades, so you can get up close to these things, and it's just a great place to run into people. This is the Vasa, which was built after the Swedish warship, the Vasa that sank in 1628. We actually got the plans from the Vasa Museum in Stockholm. So this is actually to scale. This is a steampunk thing that I built after I'd gone to Burning Man with my daughter back in 2022, and just kind of took a bunch of different ideas from things artwork I'd seen at Burning Man and shoved it all into that one little ship. We have paddle boats. This is the Voss, and then we started also a New Year's Eve celebration, which I'll talk about a little bit. This is an aerial view of the boats in the creek in about a couple of years ago, I imagine. But it just shows the boats lined up. We have about close to 30 boats now that are in the parade, if you want to call it that, or in the event, or the flotilla. We started giving rides. We took the original boat, that Hamster that I showed you from 2016, and we took it back to its bare bones and then put an electric motor on the back. And now we use this to give rides to kids for free in the winter. So sometimes we'll have 30 families lined up here to get a ride. We take them around a small portion of the flotilla. We also help with, cancer survivors, or in this case, it was a young girl I happen to know who was undergoing treatment for a brainstem tumor. Unfortunately, she passed a short while ago, but her wish was to get on this craft, so we made it happen. So on New Year's Eve, we started an event called Candlelights on the Creek, and it New Year's Eve in Frederick used to be watching this little key drop down on the suspension bridge, and there'd be a countdown, sort of like a bad, Times Square kind of thing. And often you'd have no one there, 20 people, maybe 40. And we just thought this should be a great opportunity. So we put 5,000 luminaries in the water and then started bringing in bands and food trucks. And we don't sell any alcohol, anything like that, but we just try and make it kind of a family friendly event, if you will. So I'm just going to play a short video.
Watch me dance, dance the night away. My heart could be burning, but you won't see it on my face. Watch me dance, dance the night away. I'll still keep the party burning out one at a place.
So, the importance of, I guess, using the space above the dormant water garden for us is that it allows us to fund the water garden itself. So we started out when we first put the boats in. There was no fundraising appeal, and what we decided to do was to have these boats or to expand the project, to have boats with sponsors and have the sponsors pick a local 501c3 charity to raise money for. And we started out, I think the first year was maybe 2018 to raise 6,000. And the last 2 years, we've been about $132,000 that we raise. We take about 10% of that. It used to be 30, but now we're down to 10% of the monies raised fund the entire water garden. They pay for the waiters, the fertilizers, the equipment that we need to replace, and occasionally some expansion with, new stands and maybe some fancier plant materials. But it's a very, excuse me, low budget project because we don't pay any staff and we get all these volunteers. $13,000, 10% of that basically funds the water garden. So what's next? We have a plan to have a trailer that'll be creekside that we're going to put radio controlled motorboats and sailboats in for kids, and they'll be able to come up. I think we're going to plan to start with about 60 of these boats that'll be all charged up and ready to go. We're going to partner with the city. They're going to supply some summer youth employment opportunities, and they will basically hand out these boats, take them in, recharge them, and that'll be offered free of charge to the kids. And that should launch this spring, where we've raised most of the money we need, and we're just in the final phase of designing the trailer that we're going to modify. So this is my last slide, and basically, this is one of my favorite images from Francis Pacavia, and this is Loy Kakadut. So this is basically it's the Kakadullet eye, and it turns out Francis Pacava was ill in bed and with some sort of an eye problem, and his local physician, or he got this Kakadullet, which is actually an arsenic-containing compound. It's an organic compound. I don't know. Doesn't seem like a very good idea to me. But while he was in bed, he had all of his friends came over, and they all signed their poster. This poster that he ultimately made, And some of the signatures are really pretty funny. Like I like salad, and I don't know if any of you speak French, but there's some really interesting stuff on here. And the point of this is that this project is has become a blank canvas, if you will. And there are a lot of people that are creating these festivals. They're, obviously they come up with new boat ideas every year, but it's just a place for people to come and really kind of express and to have a new idea. Having said that, we're very careful. We don't allow any kind of political, religious, ideologic messaging of any sort on the boats. And the reason for that is, there's enough things that divide us already, and so many things trigger a lot of other things. And so we try to keep it a fairly neutral space. We may empathize with all sorts of different causes, but we really are trying to keep this as universal as possible. So I think that's it.
This is really impressive. I've seen some complimentary comments in the chat. Would anybody like to unmute themselves at this point and ask Dr. Kremers some questions?
Actually,
Dr.
rather
Kramer?
than questions, I'm going to say, y'all go. These boats are phenomenal. I mean, I've missed the water garden. I didn't know about that. Oh my gosh, I screwed myself over good. But the boats, the lights, the whole ambiance of that area during the holiday season is just phenomenal. So y'all go, just go. Okay.
Dr. Kremers, didn't you say the boats would go in, you said a week or 2 weeks before Thanksgiving?
Yeah, we always launch the weekend before Thanksgiving, and that's because the night before Thanksgiving is the biggest bar night in the United States. So all the kids are home, right, and they're visiting their parents. And so if you go to Frederick the night before Thanksgiving, you can't get into a bar or a restaurant because everybody's down there. And so we like to make it the opening night, if you will, is that night. I mean, we put them in that Saturday. So this year it'll be the 23rd of November. They'll go in, and actually that's become a party. Even the boat launch is food trucks. Usually we have a DJ, something like that. It used to be, I think people would come down to see if a boat like sank on launch, and they had good reason for that. But I think now it's just become, we have a gal involved in sort of promoting this, and she's all about planning parties. So she's out there constantly doing that kind of stuff, and it's actually been a lot of fun. We have to restrict access to one side of the creek, so we don't have people walking among heavy equipment. We have 2 electric forklifts as well as that crane overhead. So we try and keep the entire south side of the creek, which is a fairly wide promenade, free of pedestrians. But you can watch from the bridge or from the other side where all the restaurants are.
This is amazing. Now, I want to go back to the beginning where you opened up talking about eutrophication and you showed the
Yep.
photos of the algae mats. What's been done to correct for that issue in the river, in the creek?
And we certainly looked at that, and if you go into Frederick now, there are a lot of places where these riparian barriers are going in. The problem, I assume in part was funding and obviously time. So we knew that is a good solution, but it's something that takes a long time before you have enough root mass to filter the water and to filter out the nutrients and slow the water down and to cool it. Even though that's happening, that's a 20 to 30 year proposition. And that's certainly going to be very helpful. Most of the rivers in the world that are undergoing this cultural eutrophication, they're basically coastal cities. Southeast Asia is a huge problem now with this, but it's sewage, it's fertilizers, all those things, and you put all these people on these riverbanks, and ultimately some of that stuff finds its way in, either intentionally or not. And I think
Which
which
sector Oh,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I was just going to ask, which sector do you think is responsible for most of it? Is it the wastewater treatment plants, or is it
No. Oh,
agriculture,
I
or?
think I think it depends. I would say if you look across the United States, most of it's agricultural. Now they go after the homeowner because they don't have a lobby. So, but I think most of it's probably the agricultural and the like chicken farms and there are certain the Amish have practices that probably aren't optimal for keeping the nutrients out of the streams, even though they're incredible gardeners and farmers. So there's and I've read different things about this, but I would say most of it's probably the bulk of it's probably farm fertilizer runoff, and then in our area, we have some residential fertilizer runoff, and we also have these paddocks, as I mentioned. I mean, if you just look 2 miles to the west, right where I live, there's lots of paddocks, and I go by them every day on my bike, and the horses and the cows, beef and dairy cow, they're just doing their business in the paddocks, and that's all running off into their little ponds, which immediately run off ultimately into the Carroll Creek. So, I think I would say agricultural is the biggest problem, not the septic systems or the wastewater treatment facilities.
That's helpful
But
information. And I know there's some
there are
questions.
none of those, by the way, in the watershed. Those are all downstream from us. So,
Yeah, and I
um,
know there's some questions in the chat, and I don't want to be a hog, but I just want to know one more thing is, are there still algae mats floating amongst the flowers, the plants?
very rarely. I mean, every once in a while you get a little stuff that wells up from the bottom. It's not that string algae and those big anaerobic masses that you saw. It's I would say it's not 100%, but I'd say it's taken care of 95% of the algae. And the other thing, you have to remember is it's a little bit like a tie-dye shirt. So if you spill, a blob of ketchup on a white shirt, you see it instantly, right? But when you have a gazillion plants to look at and there's a few little blobs of algae here and there, you don't notice it as much, right? You hardly notice it
Yeah.
at all. So, but yeah, it's nothing at all. Like, in fact, they did a study at Hood College, and they did algal plates, and they said, it had taken care of 98% of the algae with some number. They also said that the nutrient levels dropped because of the water garden. And I don't think I believe that, because most of these plants almost all of them derive their nutrients from the soil, not from, they don't pull things out. We don't have, anacris and submersible plants that will pull the nutrient out of the water. So I don't know if that's true. My guess is the water garden doesn't change the nutrient level per se. That's my feelings.
Okay, now the Kevin McIntosh wants to know about the pots and that they must be really heavy. And he's wondering what are just the logistics for moving them between the greenhouse and the canal?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry I wasn't clear about that. So once those stands go in the creek, they're there forever. The metal stands and the large pots, which are 48 quart or so, they have all the perennials. So they'll have, perennial lilies. Um, they'll have the lotus, which are perennial plants here. They'll have um, the larger like sweet flag or pickerel rush or thalia, the ones that are perennial bog plants. Those just stay right where they are. We cut off the vegetation in the fall and we don't do anything with them. They just stay there. The creek has frozen since we started this. It froze down once to about 18 inches, 2 feet. But unless it would freeze all the way down into the rhizomes, it wouldn't kill them. And most of the plant material is deeper than that,
Okay,
for those types of plants.
and that answers Jim Hughes's question, which is if the plants are safe from year to year or if they're all new every year. But you're saying if the
Yeah,
water level doesn't drop.
the only thing that we replaced about 280 tropical lilies and bog plants, and that's our main budget really, and that's only I'm gonna guess it's probably around 4 to 5 thousand a year is for all that stuff. For the
Yeah.
Victorias, and the tropical lilies. There's a lot of those, and those it would make no sense to try to overwinter them. because the cost of overwintering them is spectacular. You need to heat the water troughs they're in, and you'd have the logistical nightmare of, I mean, these things, even the 19 quart pot, the plastic pot, forget the stand would stay. Pot itself is really quite heavy. And you'd have to cart those to the greenhouse and then put them in and pull them out. It's, I can get those plants for probably $7, $8 a piece. So it's really economically, it doesn't make sense to try and save any of our material that's an annual.
All right, and you're getting lots of laud in the comments, but I'll just stick to the ones that are questions. Kate McLean wants to know if the koi control the algae at all. Fish do eat some of that.
Not really. I mean, there are, they like I have my own little pond. That's how I learned to do this. And they're picking algae off the walls and things, but they don't do a very good job of it. And in fact, when back in 2012, there were lots of carp in there, and they weren't obviously doing much to arrest the algae. The algae just grows so fast. And we did have some. I'm glad you brought that up. But we had some invasive plants. We had hydrilla, and we have duckweed, and curly leaf pondweed. And the water garden seemed, just by shading them out, seems to have taken care of all the hydrilla. The pondweed's a little bit of a problem in the early spring. And every once in a while we see some duckweed, but there's also a little bit of a natural current. And I don't know if you've noticed that from the pictures, but we leave the edge of the thing open. I'm going to see if I can find one here. It shows this better.
As you're looking, I just wonder if some of the water quality improvements are related to the fact that you'll draw it down in the spring and you stir it up and it gets more oxygenation, and if that helps, because you have, more dissolved oxygen, if that's helped with the water quality improvements as well.
There is
Go ahead.
some oxygenation because they have the fountains going on both sides, which then pour into the creek, and that's a recycling thing, so that as the water goes airborne, it oxygenates. But I don't know that that's enough.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, all those fountains were running back in 2012. So, and there are some there's a little oxygenation that they have these weirs that the water flows over 2 weirs before it gets to this water garden. And then, as Jim mentioned, there are some, some of these kind of things which recirculate a little bit. But I think in general, there's not nearly enough aeration to make a difference. We did look at, adding fountains and stuff, but for instance, we have a pond just to where I showed you that picture of the headwaters where the initial inlets are, and they have deep and superficial aeration, and they still have a huge problem there. So it's, it certainly helps because it allows for a greater bacterial breakdown of the detritus at the bottom. One option also is to use something like phospholock, which precipitates the phosphorus, because in marine environments, phosphorus is the critical nutrient. So there's always going to be plenty of nitrogen. This is the reverse. I mean, this is freshwater I'm talking. The reverse is the marine. So marine environment has is starved for phosphorus, starved for nitrogen. Freshwater environments like this are really, phosphorus is the key. So if you can lock up the phosphorus, you can also make a huge dent in your growth.
Jim again. Speaking, is the water garden at its, what's the word I'm looking for? Its final size, or is it still growing?
Well, right now the water level is about 2 feet below what you're looking at, so it's done.
No, I don't mean that. I mean,
you mean physical size? Are we going to expand it?
Yes.
Yeah. I think, there's a hotel that's coming into Frederick. You're aware of that, right? The old Frederick News Post building, and is right. It's just to the east of Carroll Street, and it's going to be a big massive expense for the hotel, and it's I think it'll be pretty impressive. So what we're going to probably do is extend the water garden in front of that hotel and probably the boats as well. So that's going to add another, I don't know, 150 feet to the water garden. So right now we're at almost 3/8 of a mile. So we're probably the largest free public water garden in the world at this point. The problem for us is because we're all volunteer, if we extend this much more than we have it now, it'll be harder to get everything taken care of in what I would consider a reasonable amount of time, which is 2 hours. What I found is that if we keep people, 3 hours, 4 hours, they don't want to come back. I want people to be able to come in, know that we're organized, get it done, and get out in a couple of hours. So, for instance, this Saturday, we're going to be cutting all the vegetation off and getting the anchor set, and we'll start at, probably 8 o'clock, and we should be done by 10. So, for that reason, I don't really want to extend it too much more because I want people to be able to get in, get out. I mean, that's the way that I feel that we can keep our volunteers coming back and having volunteers that know what's going on, as opposed to having to explain every time to, a lot of new people. It makes things so much easier for all of us that are involved on the organizational side.
Thank
Did that
you.
answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Are there any more questions that people want to ask verbally?
I'm curious, sorry, when you say we, I wonder what kind of management committee or is that the general me sort of being we? I hope you have some help in that core group decision making.
Yeah. So basically, I would say we have for the water garden, I kind of orchestrate it, but I would say there's probably 4 or 5 people that are like the key participants, people that have heavy equipment, people that have physical strength that I'm lacking, and that we get together and we kind of run through things, usually a week or two before the planting season. So it's a small core group, and I would say the boats is the same group plus another 2 or 3 people that aren't involved in the water garden, that have just more of a limited interest in the boats only. But, when we, like, for instance, in the boat season, although I probably managed or still manage 5 or 6 boats, most of them are run by individual teams and they do the construction and all that stuff. So it's just a matter of getting information to them about, what our expectations are and, the launch dates and what we expect them to do on launch day and on retrieval day and throughout the season. And so it's very, the command and control has a very tight center core, but then there's lots of other help on the periphery, and we've, over the years, we have a list of people that we know we can call. And if we get in a jam, they can help us out with a boom or, a piece of equipment, a crane or forklifts. But it's really, I hate to say it's cookbook at this point, but it kind of is. We order the plant material and November, and we get a wholesale price from one of the vendors down in Florida, and I don't mean to minimize the work because getting to where we are, we made a lot of mistakes, and learned some hard lessons along the way. But I think we have it to the point where we know every year the water garden will be successful. It's just that we try to get fancier and fancier with these Victorias and things like that. We're looking at using some Australian lilies this year as well, which may or may not require heat. But in general, we try and keep our eye on the ball and just, it's a very loose organization. We don't even have a mission statement, for Christ's sake. I think it's, if we had one, it would be, like color, joy, and light or something. But we try to not pin ourselves in. We try and let anybody who has an idea for the water garden or use of the water of the water during the dormant season. We just try and keep an open mind because that way we figure we're going to get a much more creative and lasting event, you know, because otherwise things get stale, right? And people say, "Oh, I saw the same boats last year." Well, we change up the boats a lot. So the bottom 5 boats pretty much sit out every year, and that allows us to, bring in new, fresh ideas. And most people try to change their boat theme over the course of a couple of years. You may see the same. There are a couple of boats that have been in there for 5 or 6 years, but they almost always change the paint colors or the look of the boat. And so it's a lot of that though is done by the individual teams. We're not directing that because that would be we would stifle their creativity, right? So we try to let people have a reasonably free hand at what they want to do.
Thanks. I also want to say thank you in general. It's a beautiful project. I'm still baffled by the water quality change. And I gather you attribute that mostly to the plants themselves. You're not treating it at all, are you?
Oh no, we don't treat it. No, and basically, water gardening, the history goes back to the Egyptians, right? So, and basically, one of the tenets, if you will, is that if you can cover 40 to 60% of the surface of the water with lily pads or shade from, the bog plants or the lotus leaves, you can get really good algae control. And the smaller the pond in general, the more coverage you need. So really, for the smaller pond, you might want to shoot for 60%. For a larger body of water like this, probably 40% is sufficient. And it's really the sunlight just dampens the algae growth. It cools the water. And the other thing about algae blooms, which are hard to predict, you need the right levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and temperature. But even if all three are present, you don't necessarily get an algae bloom. So it's kind of, and most of that's cyanobacter that you're seeing, those mats. There is some string algae as well. But I think most of it's attributable to simple sunlight deprivation. I think that's what gives us the water quality.
Um, this is Kathy Gents here. I was just going to jump in and say the other thing that people do if they can't get enough plant coverage over the surface, as you say, to knock back the algae, is to add a dye, a natural dye to the water to make it dark on the surface, or they can just do that temporarily until the plants fill in. So that's why you'll see some of that. And Longwood does it in their water garden because the reflection looks pretty when you have like a almost midnight looking water with the water lilies glimmering on the surface. Makes gorgeous photos.
Absolutely. So we actually looked at water dyes, and in one year we did because they were doing work on the creek, and they literally stopped all the flow.
Oh,
It was completely stagnant. So we put in a black water dye to deal with the algae. And like I don't know if you heard the earlier part of the talk. Is this Kathy who wrote the book?
yes.
Oh, I've read your book on Lotus. It's great. But at any rate,
Oh no, not the Lotus book. I've written other books, but I'm
Oh.
the editor of the Water Garden Society, so we know each other through that
Oh,
way.
okay. Oh, okay, fine. So at any rate, yeah, we did in that one season use it, but unfortunately there's too much flow. And because it's a state waterway, they wouldn't let us put the dye in. I had to get special permission from the Department of Agriculture in Maryland to use the water dye that one time. So, but you're right, they're great because they're really just vegetable dyes, right? And and the photography is spectacular. And as I think a lot of people know, that if you've studied Monet, he liked the space, the reflection between the flowers and the pads much more than he liked the flowers themselves. And I don't think I've captured it well in some of these pictures, but I also agree. I mean, it's just it can be a wonderful thing for photography.
It's very dramatic, but not needed in your case. And I think the creek looks so beautiful and it's very photogenic every day. But I was just going to say the person you were thinking of, Kelly Billing.
Oh, Kelly, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Kelly,
I'm sorry. But you do the Water Garden Journal, maybe.
Correct. And Kelly Billing,
okay.
water.
And your picture was on the front, correct?
of the
Okay.
of the creek. But
Sorry,
watering up the garden is her business, and she's also in Maryland, but she's a lotus specialist. Yep,
correct. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm
incredible.
sorry, I went off on the wrong tangent, but I know who you are.
No worries. But yeah, all glory to Kelly because she is the lotus goddess of the world, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I don't know if you heard earlier, but I was talking about Tim Jennings and
Mhm.
Suzanne Boom, and
Yep.
they've given me advice over the years when I have problems with pests or and Suzanne was at Lily Ponds after John Sander left for a number of years, and now she's got this great job up at Longwood, and it's amazing to have those kind of resources available to us because as I said, all of us, none of us had any real botany training or even water garden experience for that matter. So it's been a godsend to have the Water Garden Society kind of so close to us in many ways. So
Mhm.
I wanted to interject one thing for the backyard pond maintenance. I
yep.
installed and maintained ponds for over a decade professionally and don't have fish. If you drop your nitrogen, you won't have algae. So I maintain right now, because I'm retired from that business, I maintain two fairly large still water ponds, no fish, no algae, lots of plants. So that's the other formula for kind of eliminating or controlling algae in small ponds. But everybody, of course, wants fish because that's why they make the pond. And I'm like, no, keep the fish out of it. Let the frogs have it, and you won't have algae. Just
Yeah.
an
Good advice,
observation.
Carol.
Well,
Ponds are very different than creeks and rivers that have different inputs in terms of water. I don't want to keep Dr. Kremers much longer, but I wanted to offer the club's thanks, and I'll send you a copy of the recording, Dr. Kremers, and I really appreciate you taking the time tonight.
Sure, thank you. It's very nice. And
I
go ahead, Jim.
I will end with one little bit of humor. I'm on the creek fairly often, and they have the koi, some koi in there still, and you'll hear people, children at the edge of the creek going, "Oh wow, look, 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 look!" But they also have these ginormous black carp,
Mm.
and all of a sudden you'll hear a child scream and jump back because all of a sudden they realize that Moby Dick is down there.
That's true. And now, and the water quality has improved dramatically. So it used to be it was pretty much just carp, and then people started throwing their pet koi in there. I think some of the golf courses were if they were cleaning a pond, they would
Mhm.
throw their extra fish in here. But now we have actually quite a bit of like smallmouth bass and a lot of panfish, a lot of bluegills and sunfish. So and we never saw that before, so it's okay. But I have to say, like I have my own water garden, which is not very big. It's probably 10 by 30 feet, but I probably have 80 or 90 fairly large koi in there in my water garden. And I really don't have an algae problem because, I mean, in part, I keep a lot of coverage of the water. I would say at least 65% in my case. And then and I do have a biofilter that's sort of a commercial grade, like one of those old bubble beads. And I really haven't found algae to be a problem for me. But I think it's because I have so much coverage of the water, and I do leave an open area where I can, feeding, and I feed the fish, which is also adds a lot of breakdown products. But it's feeding time is always a riot for the kids that come over and the grandkids, and so I don't know. I would have to say I like having fish, and I think it can be done if you maintain enough coverage and have reasonable biofiltration, because you need that for just the health of the fish. You've got to break down the urea to nitrates and then remove the nitrates. So, at any rate, that's my 2 cents on that.
Well, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. What a great way to celebrate the end of the gardening season and to look forward to the Thanksgiving event or the day before Thanksgiving. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right, good night.